Thanks, Peter, and thank you all for being here. Appreciate it very much. I hope you spent a lot of time watching the Olympics on television. You probably may know more than I do, actually, because you got a lot of commentation. I was sort of there. Insider meant I was probably more cloistered than the rest of them. I think Gail Somershine may know more than I did because she was really there going around as a member of the crowd. I was mainly there focused on what Chicago was doing, but I was there for 23 days. All the TV I saw was CCTV in Chinese, and the only paper I read was the China Daily, which isn't often the most objective paper over there. But I will say that it was a fantastic experience, and probably there will never again be as superb an organization just purely of the Olympic Games, with all due apologies to our British friends. It was, you know, and now I can only imagine what it must be like over there now, because I remember walking into the Marriott Marquis Hotel after everyone had left the Atlanta Games, and it was like a ghost town, and it's sort of overwhelming, this idea of all of this intense effort, and it ends so abruptly. And I'm always reminded of a famous quote by Jesse Owens when they asked him about winning the 100-meter dash in the 1936 Games in Berlin. He said it's a lifetime of training for just 10 seconds. And the Chinese have just gone through basically 7 years of preparation for just 17 days. But for them, I will tell you, it's been more like 25 years or almost 30 years of training, because they have been focused on this for some time. And I think really the beginning of their focus on this was in 1984, when they broke the Soviet boycott and came to the Olympic Games in Los Angeles, which was their first time in the Olympic Games since the 1952 Games in Helsinki. Following that, they bid successfully for the Asian Games, which they held in 1990. Some of the venues that were used in these games were venues that they had built for the Asian Games. And they also bid for the 2000 Games, which they lost by 2 votes to Sydney, which stung them very badly, but they're reluctant to admit this, but in a lot of ways that probably was the best thing that could have happened to them, because they could have never done in the year 2000 what they were able to accomplish in the year 2008. It's amazing for me, just from my own personal perspective, to see what's happened. My first trip to China was 1990, when Atlanta was bidding for the Games, and I went to take the IOC member who is still there. He's 78 years old now, but he and his wife to dinner, and you know, you landed in this airport that was like a big barn with about 20 gates. It was a nice winding pastoral 2-lane road that led into Beijing. You know, people were still riding bicycles. A lot of people were still wearing Mao suits. The only place you could shop as a foreigner was a store called the Friendship Store, which didn't have a lot of selection, as you can imagine, and you had to buy this script that they gave you to go there. And of course now you land at, you know, it's hard to describe this new airport terminal they've built, which is the biggest terminal in the world. It looks like a dragon when you're flying in, and you ride in on this 8-lane road into town, and just what's happened there. Every time I go back, I'm sort of continuously amazed and overwhelmed by what they've done. And like the other Asian cities that have hosted the Games, this was really a coming out party of sorts for them. The 1964 Games were in Tokyo, which really marked their emergence from the problems of World War II and emerging on the world scene and becoming the economic force that we know they did. The 1988 Games in Seoul were the same thing for Korea, where they emerged from all the ravages of the Korean conflict and really took a place as a major player in the world scene. And now China, who I think you can say is really emerging from the ravages of the Cultural Revolution, and what they have done over the last 25 or 30 years to prepare this is amazing. And it was really, I think, highlighted by their emergence politically, economically, and education, and arts and sciences, and certainly if you look at their performance, their emergence as an athletic power. There's a lot of words that have been used to describe these games, lots of adjectives. I don't know if there are enough adjectives. I think the one that I keep coming back to a lot of times is historic. They were historic, they were spectacular, they were monumental, In somewhat of an ironic statement, the president of the IOC called them truly exceptional. Many of you will remember that everybody in Atlanta got mad when President Samaranch said our games were most exceptional. Well, you know, it's not so bad now. It was, these were truly exceptional. I'm not sure what the distinction is there. But President Samaranch, who was there, who's 88 years old and looking fit and getting around and doing a lot of amazing things, did declare that these were the greatest games ever. And in a lot of ways, I think he was right. I think they also show that if you have what probably is unlimited funding, and if you have unlimited human resources, and if you have total control and total power, you can put on a pretty amazing games. We're not ever going to be able to do that. Certainly, they weren't without some flaws, but they were truly overwhelming. I think the other thing, of course, now we know, and it was confirmed, that they were the most watched games without question in history. Even more viewers in the United States than viewed the Atlanta games, so it was way beyond any other games not within the United States. 450 million people, I think, in China watched the opening ceremony. So it was without question the most watched games in history. I think also it may have been the most scrutinized games in history from a media perspective. And a lot of this was exacerbated by the problems in Darfur and Tibet and all the things leading up to, which just kind of laid out an opportunity and the challenges that the media kept having as far as what their access was going to be. But I do think that the world learned a lot about China, without question, and I don't think there's any doubt that China also learned a lot about the world. So I was going to maybe share with you what I thought were maybe the positives and negatives, and then certainly answer some questions, which I know you would have, maybe talk about what the long-term impact can be. My first impression that really overwhelmed me, that I probably wasn't expecting to the extent it was the hospitality. It was extraordinary. They had, I don't know how many young volunteers. They say they had 80,000 official volunteers. They say they had almost 1 million people who were manned to do different things. Volunteer may be an interesting term, but these people were unbelievable. They were everywhere. They were smiling. They would welcome you. They would try to help you do what you needed to do. A lot of them, I will say, didn't know but maybe 4 things in English. They knew hello, welcome, goodbye, and thank you for your cooperation. And I don't know, everywhere you went, you would go through and get wanded, and it was a very efficient process, but after everyone, thank you for your cooperation, thank you for your cooperation. It was pretty amazing. But it was, they kept going back. I think their theme for these games was a quote from Confucius that they used in the opening ceremonies, and they kept coming back from, which is, how very glad we are to welcome friends from afar. And I will tell you that the security, which I thought might be overwhelming, was really not overwhelming. Interestingly enough, they had a lot of uniformed people there at different places, standing at attention. And when you first got there, and even when you had an accreditation, they would look at it, and they would look at you, and they would look at that, and they would look at you and ask you something. But the IOC kind of got on them about it, and by the end of about a week, they were all, good morning, how are you? I was a little taken aback. The first security guard I ran into, he had an accreditation on. His name was Wang Wang Wang, which I thought was an amazing name. I commented on that. I don't know if he knew what I was saying or not, but anyway, it was quite something. But you know, the interesting thing to me is you did think that it was going to be. I never saw a gun the whole time I was there, except when I was outside a bank one time and they had an armored truck picking up money, which is, you know, in Barcelona, I remember they had a tank in front of the IOC hotel and people on the roof with machine guns. So it was, you know, everything they did, you could tell, had security conscious decisions. They had way too many fences, and I'll get to the whole idea of access to different places. You had a lot of people sort of looking through fences, but as far as just an overwhelming military presence, it was not there. I will say, too, that the sort of Much Ado About Nothing award had to do with all of this talk about pollution, because I kept thinking, I kept worrying as I got up to it, because they kept harping on it, but I kept saying, look, they've shut down all manufacturing, they've shut this down, they're keeping cars off the road, they're seeding clouds, they're doing everything in the world, it'll work. And it was not a problem. And sadly, Haile Gebrselassie, the great Ethiopian runner, now regrets that he did not run in the marathon, because the pollution was not a problem. A problem which Gail will verify is the first week, the heat and humidity was like nothing I have ever seen here, on the low country of Georgia, South Carolina, it was truly overwhelming. It was hotter and more humid than any place I've ever, which I think may have had something to do with them seeding clouds to keep the rain away for opening ceremonies. And the stadium, the Bird's Nest is a wonderful architectural masterpiece. Inside, it's not the greatest stadium, and I can tell you there is no air movement. The only air moving was those jets on the flagpole that would blow the flags out. That was about the only air that moved. But I will say, when I left the opening ceremonies, having been in the stadium for about 7 hours, I know I was soaking wet, and my hair was plastered down, and no telling what. And I had on a coat and tie, which was another cold issue. But who did I run into getting on the bus but Mitt Romney, who looked like he just stepped out of the makeup room on NBC. He didn't have a hair out of place. Everything was right. I can only imagine that maybe he had been in a suite or something like that. But anyway, speaking of the opening ceremonies, I think all of you who saw it know that it was truly an outstanding spectacle. I mean, it was really something the likes of which I've never seen. I was telling the guy who's in charge of our venues in Chicago, I said, look, have you budgeted in this hole in the ground that we got to build for all these things to come out of? And he said, you know, that hole in the ground would cost more than our stadium cost. So it was really quite something. You hear a lot of stories about what they went through to make that happen in rehearsals, 16 hours a day, people wearing diapers because there were no bathroom breaks and all that, which I imagine may have been true. It was a little bit telling when the creator of the opening ceremony said the only other country that could probably have the discipline and focus to put on something like that was North Korea, which I found to be an interesting comparison. But I truly think that the only people who will ever do something like that will if they give the games to Dubai, because they'll do something. They'll spend the money that it takes to do something. You know, the reaction that came there were two reactions which were interesting. One was the fact that it went through this whole history of China, but there was never a mention of Mao, which is kind of interesting when you're there, because I get a sense, here's a guy whose picture is right up there at the Forbidden City. His tomb is there. He's on every denomination of currency. But you feel like, you know, I don't know where all that fits into the general scheme of things. The other kind of surreal moment, and there were surreal moments, was the fact that, as we alluded to, that Russia invaded Georgia on the day of opening ceremonies. And I will say that, you know, I love these sort of what I consider poignant moments in the games, but the president of Georgia wanted the Georgia team to come home. And the IOC prevailed on them to stay. And the day after, you know, as it would turn out in judo, a Russian and a Georgian won medals in an event. And they had a great photo opportunity of them hugging each other, which in many ways is what I've always thought the Olympics is all about. In the area of superlatives, there's no doubt, there's no need to go into any detail. It's the best Olympic village ever, without question. It was a wonderfully efficient, made-to-order built Olympic village that worked perfectly. I think the sports venues were as good as you can have as far as just the ability to perform the sports, the organization of the sporting events. All of the federations were very pleased. And in a way, that's what the Olympics are all about. It's all about sport. After everything's said and done, when the games begin and you can focus on sport and these human spectacles of great achievements in sport, that's what's great. And certainly we have two now new icons of the Olympic Games in Michael Phelps and his 8 gold medals, and also Usain Bolt and the 3 world records that he set. But there were other great moments. They're too numerous to mention them. I think Dara Torres is an amazing story. To me personally, Nastya Liukin of the gymnast was an amazing story, because I was there when she won her gold medals. And I think about my first Olympic Games was when Atlanta was bidden in 1988 in Seoul, and her father won 2 gold medals for the Soviet Union at those games. So it was sort of an interesting juxtaposition there. The men's volleyball team gold medal was certainly very poignant because, as you know, the head coach, his father-in-law had been stabbed and his mother-in-law severely injured in that terrible accident. I think the amazing thing to me is I had no idea how popular basketball was in China. I mean, the U.S. team was without question the most popular thing there. The Chinese loved them. Kobe Bryant and LeBron James jerseys are way outselling Yao Ming jerseys in China. And what I didn't realize either is the arena there, which looks like a regular American arena, is owned partly by the NBA, because they're getting ready to launch NBA China in China. And I can only imagine, I really, that was, and one of the real rock stars of the games was Kobe Bryant, because not only was he a great, but he went to a lot of venues and was there smiling and cheering on, and I guess to see, I saw the team in Athens, which was a mess because it wasn't a team, and what they did, they never came together. But this team of, quadrimillionaires, to see their emotion and their feeling at winning the gold medal was really fantastic. And I guess one irony to me about the medal count, I think the medal count actually came out like most people predicted. China won the most gold, which was predicted. They probably won a little bit more, 2 or 3 more than predicted. We won some less. The totals were about the same. But the interesting thing is to see the move in what the Chinese are doing, because when the Chinese came back into the Olympic movement, as you would expect from a more collective society, they were very much into team sports. Individual sports would not be important. That didn't fit into their general culture. But they soon realized that you don't get enough medals in team sports. You got 20 football players, you get credit. They all get medals, but you as a country only get credit for 1 medal. So interestingly enough, they've gone the other way, whereas the U.S. did very well in the team sports. So if we got 110 medals, which is the most we've ever gotten in a non-boycotted games, and they got 100 medals. But if you count individual medals given with every team member, we got 315 medals and they got 180. So it's interesting to get that juxtaposition. I think the most amazing thing they did, because to me the most difficult thing to do in any Olympic Games is transportation. There's no city in the world that's set up to host an event like this, and they did a magnificent job. Now, they're set up right. They've got these broad, wide, 6-lane roads that traverse all through there, the ring roads, the Olympic lanes they had, which were just for Olympic vehicles, worked wonderfully. And I don't think I never heard any complaint from any constituency about transportation. I can't imagine how many buses and cars they had, but that hall worked flawlessly. And I think the most overwhelming thing, just to me, every time I rode out, was the flowers. The flowers, the shrubbery, the trees. It was a garden. The whole city, every road was lined with blooming flowers, big trees, parks, topiaries, all these things, and immaculately cleaned. I don't know how much they spent on that or how much the maintenance of it was, but it was unbelievable, and I'll be interested to see how long it lasts. There were awesome achievements. There were some shortcomings, as there always are. I think the biggest and most glaring one, which probably is not so much a surprise, is that there wasn't really a lot of soul or a lot of atmosphere or a lot of festive feeling in the games. In the arenas, yes. But once you got outside the arenas, it was a fairly antiseptic, sort of sterile feeling. Now, they began to work on this as time went on. I don't know how much of a perspective you had on this, but they had this huge area of the Olympic Green where the Bird's Nest and the Water Cube and several other venues, the press centers and broadcast centers, all the sponsor hospitality. And it is this vast area that they built for this. And I remember walking across from the indoor stadium where the gymnastics was over to the hospitality area, and you felt like you were on the Sahara Desert, and it was just this broad expanse of concrete with about 200 people, because you had to be either accredited or have a ticket to get in there. And so nobody was going. Well, they finally, and the IOC worked on them with this, they began handing out 50,000 coupons a day just to get people in there. And that helped. It didn't do enough because they didn't have all the other stuff you need. To have a good live site, you need music, you need food, you need TV screens and this, that, and the other. But it helped. But in the end, there wasn't a lot of, I read one news report, I think he summed it up. He said the games were like a perfectly dressed mannequin. They were beautiful, but not a lot of soul. The other challenges were language and signage. I think the signage was all a security ploy. If you just kept people confused about where they were, then they weren't going to cause any trouble. But it was challenging sometimes to get around. And the one effort that I know they must have made that did not work was trying to teach the taxi drivers how to speak English. It just didn't work. And taxi rides I have great stories of taxi rides, and it was interesting because none of our hand signals actually work in China. You know, you would get it, I would always get the concierge to write the address in Chinese, and sometimes it worked. But then maybe I'd be going somewhere I'd been before, and you knew you're close, and you know it's down there, and you kind of tell the guy to go. And I think this in China means stop and glare at me or something like that, because you weren't really getting anything. So Dave Barry, he was over there, the guy that's the comic writer for the Herald. He wrote a great article on his taxi ride experience. But it was truly a challenge. I think the other challenge they had was empty seats. And they tried to work on that. I don't know what happened. I mean, they held a lot of seats for Chinese, and that's correct. I mean, they're the biggest country in the world. They wanted to make sure that these games were for their people, and they claimed it was a sellout, and they may have, but somehow the tickets weren't getting used or distributed, and they didn't have a good redistribution system. And they started bussing in fans, but it was just a problem that I'm not sure why. I mean, the Chinese were a little bit like the Greeks in that they were going to always support things where their teams were doing well. That was a mess in Greece because their teams don't do that well. In China, they were doing well everywhere, so it was pretty good. But there was a problem of the ticket distribution, and people couldn't understand because you'd want tickets. Scalping's not a big deal over there either, but you'd want tickets and you'd want to get them, and they'd tell you the event was sold out, and then you'd get there and there'd be 1,000 empty seats. Obviously, the biggest challenge, and the one that I think they still struggle with the most, is media relations, the whole idea of press access, freedom of the press, human rights, and those kinds of things. The press will tell you that their working conditions, all of their access to venues, all of their ability to do their job was immaculate, but I think, they always felt like in press conferences they never could get the answers to the questions. It's just not in their culture to talk about problems or to talk about things or to acknowledge that anything's happening. I think the access was probably overplayed. I think they had access to everything they needed. Once, there was a lot of negotiation that went on. I did notice, and I did watch CNN every now and then, and I really don't think, usually when you're over there and there's some kind of news report that's bad, your TV blacks out. But you really didn't see any of that during this. I think what I didn't understand was things like setting up these protest zones and then not giving anybody a permit to go. But I truthfully think that the Chinese were so taken and I think surprised and shocked and by the reaction to the torch relay when it went internationally. I don't think they could understand, and frankly, in some ways, why people would attack the Olympic torch to the extent they did in London and Paris and San Francisco and some of these other places. And I think that just made them come in that much more closer, that we can't afford to have any kind of protest anywhere. So I think, too, I will say this. I know a lot of people love to criticize the IOC about what they're doing and what they ought to do and this, that, and the other. I really think those criticisms are sort of short-sighted. I mean, everybody says, okay, what are you going to do? They didn't give Joey Cheek, who's a great Olympian, who's working for this team Darfur, a visa. Well, the IOC can't go to a sovereign country and tell them who to let into their country. If the games had been here and somebody that was on our hit list wasn't going to come in, they weren't going to be able to tell us to let them in. You can only contribute so much to a positive change. And I think the IOC was basically asking China to host the world and to host this event and to host it in a wonderful way. And it's like you're invited to somebody's home. You don't walk in there and rearrange the furniture. You walk in there and you be a guest and let them do what they have to do. So I do think that there's no doubt that, to me, hosting these games has accelerated a lot of positive change in China. Certainly there's a long way to go. Certainly there are things that I think we would like to see happen. And I think there's a real question about where will China go from here? What will be the lasting legacy of these games? Obviously, they have a huge legacy of venues and infrastructure. And they've made a huge impact on the games. And like all games, I think only time will tell what the real impact of the games will be on China. I would certainly hope that they would continue to build on all of the things that they did to open up and grow and to become part of the world community that happened. China's changed a lot, as I said, in the last 30 years. The change didn't begin with the Olympic Games. I don't think the change will end with the Olympic Games, but I think the Olympic Games did a lot to accelerate this change. And what I think touched me in a lot of ways as I walked around China and went to all these places were these young volunteers, because I saw in them a generation of people who probably had not been subjected to too much of the outside world, who were really interacting with people from all over the world. And you think about their parents were probably not allowed to talk to foreigners, and just the whole new idea of what this meant to them and their feelings. And, you know, I talked to a couple of them. One of them, who was a hostess for an IOC member, was leaving the day before the closing to go to college in Fargo, North Dakota. I don't think she has any idea what she's getting into going to Fargo, North Dakota. And others would ask you, they all want to be educated, they all want to come to the United States, and you know, I think there's just great opportunities there. But certainly the games are a great source of pride, a great source of satisfaction for the Chinese people. And I think we always have to remember that these are a people who are still recovering from a certain sense of victimization and inferiority that was through the 19th and 20th century. In the 19th century, the Opium Wars and the Western powers that were coming in, and then in the 20th century with Japan. And I'm hoping that these games can make them feel more confident, make them overcome some of this, and really, you know, not feel like they are respected and know they are respected, because I think feeling good about yourself and feeling like people do accept you and respect you goes a long way in you opening up and giving more in the way of human rights and things like that. So I'm hoping that they will become less sensitive to foreign criticism and more willing to accept their weaknesses. I think that's what they yearn for. They want respect. They want legitimacy. I think President Bush was right to go to the games. I think if we're going to move, as we move forward, they are going to be an important, if not one of the most important players in world affairs, and we've got to partner with them successfully. So, again, the legacy will be determined out in the future. We'll see what happens. You know, they spend an awful lot of money. They talk about $43 billion. I would imagine, truth be known, they maybe spent more like $100 billion. They've got huge reserves. I think we can only hope that they will continue to use this money in a positive way to build infrastructure, to build a social structure. They've still got huge problems out in their rural areas that they need to deal with, and they won't take this money and build a lot of aircraft carriers and missiles and things like that. So anyway, only time will tell. But I will say that there's no doubt that it was a fantastic experience for their country, for the Chinese people, I think for everybody who went there. And I agree that from an organizational and operational point of view, it was probably the best Olympic Games ever. So thank you.
That was undoubtedly one of the most complete, thorough, analytical presentations I've ever heard on any subject. I have to congratulate you on one side. On the other side, I don't particularly appreciate what you said, because as you went through your inventory of issues, I had great questions, and then you proceeded to answer them.
Yeah, that's right.
So I feel thoroughly disarmed by it.
You're going to bear up, I'm sure. You'll come up with something. Yeah.
You know, you did say one thing, though, because I think at the end of the day, the great thing going for us in dealing with the Chinese is the Chinese are ultimately the great pragmatists of the world. You know, they're going to do things in their own best interest. But I think you said one thing about young people, and it echoed something I heard just this morning on the radio. John Lewis was interviewed, and he talked about Obama. Now, I don't mean to offend any of the Republicans in the room, but I thought this was a very telling and touching remark, especially for those of us who've lived in this part of the United States for the last decades. He said, you know, you're talking about Obama being a person who never tasted the fruit of segregation. And so you got a different man. Mm-hmm. And I think what you're alluding to here is exactly the same thing. And I think that's what we've got to hope for, the new Chinese man, because change obviously has to take place there if they're going to continue the economy. So you have great hope. You came away with great.
Well, I mean, like I said, I mean, that's what I always came back to as I saw these young people, is they're the future of China. They have an opportunity that their parents never had. There were some articles. I still am amazed because I talk to people here who still think China's, kind of backward in third world. And when you tell them that they've got all these vast shopping centers, huge skyscrapers, nightclubs, restaurants, people staying up in karaoke bars till 4 in the morning and all of that. But they talk about the young people who are living in Beijing and doing well and sending money back to their parents who are still living in a mud hut out in some rural area. So there's still a lot of interesting things to deal with, but I agree with you. I mean, that's what gave me hope, is that this was a tremendous event for them and gave them sort of the pride and everything else, and what you'd hope is the idea of there is a great world out there. We need to be part of it. We need to interact with people in that basis.
And I think it cries out for us to figure out ways to help these people along, because they do have huge internal problems that haven't been solved, very basic things relating to the environment and water and things of this nature. And they're going to need a lot of help to get through the rough spots so these younger people can come along. What kind of opportunities do you see for us in the future? You've traveled around the world probably more than most people anywhere. And you've seen what's happened in Tokyo, what happened in these great cities of the world as a result of the games. You've alluded to some of these things, but what kind of opportunities do you see for the United States to move in after the games and take advantage of this Olympic spirit?
No, that's hard for me to answer, because I'm a big believer in, as I said, it's important we can talk to them and address their problems and maybe have some criticisms of things that we don't agree with, but it's important to maintain the dialogue and to maintain the partnership and to communicate, and that's because most people and most of the problems we have, unfortunately, and I've talked to you about this, it's the same thing with Russia. The Russians went through a period of feeling totally disrespected, totally irrelevant. We've written you off, to hell with it, and now they're fighting back. They didn't like it. And you've got to talk and communicate and let people understand what your motivations are, and try to not act like we're the monolithic power that can go resolve everything and do everything and remake everything in our own image. Because frankly, the Chinese are probably not that impressed with everything over here right now, because our economy's in shambles. We're not as much of a world player because we're bogged down. So I'm big on just this whole communication. But, I know I'm an idealist. I believe in the Olympics. I believe in sport. You see things at these kinds of events of people coming together that you hope can be translated. And again, I go back to, I hope they'll now focus their attention on peaceful, productive, good pursuits, because, they probably want to be the biggest military power too, which is not the most important thing, but it'd be hard to tell them that. So you don't want them to start escalating the arms race again by doing all this sort of stuff, but that may happen.
We have a challenge.
That's part of it.
We have a challenge. Yes, sir.
Charlie, would you comment sort of on the difference between how it happened in China, with this huge amount of money, 80 and I guess it was all a government-operated thing, and how it happened here in Atlanta, where it was more of a corporation than private thing?
Yeah, I started to talk about that. Atlanta, interestingly enough, and nobody knew this, Atlanta was a watershed games for the Olympic movement, because, we were following the L.A. model. And what we learned early on was that was no good anymore. That was a point in time. The games had grown immeasurably. We were a smaller city. You can't put on the games with just private money. It's too big. It's too complicated. And so what the IOC has come up with is a real effort to try to put a public and private partnership together. What they want is they want the public facilities to build the infrastructure, build the venues, build the long-lasting things. You raise from the private sector the money to operate the games, do things that are totally games-related. China has taken it way over here. London will be a pullback to a little bit more their model. China was an absolute, unequivocal, total government deal. They had this wonderful guy, Wang Wei, who was the head of the bid committee, of the organizing committee, BOCOG. He's Western educated, very articulate, good guy, but he would tell you that he was just administrating. All the decisions were made by the 22 top people and the guy Liu Qi, who's like number 15 on that list or whatever. So, you know, that's what they did, and that's the way they did it. And sure, as I said, it makes things a lot easier. You know, Chicago's facing that now. One of the problems is that the IOC requires an unconditional guarantee from the federal government of any bid city. And what that is like an insurance policy. You're saying if they run out of money, we'll guarantee the shortfall. Well, you're not going to get that in this country. And it's tough because that was the biggest problem we had in Atlanta. We never could spend money till we raised money. So it affected a lot of our decisions, which made things hard. We had to negotiate our TV rights a year ahead of when they said the market was, because we had to have a marketable contract before we could start building the stadium. So you do need, you know, I mean, I frankly think that the government ought to be more involved in sports things, and we're talking about obesity and all these problems, but that's not going to happen in this country. So interestingly enough, Chicago does have a $500 million guarantee from the city of Chicago as a backup. And they understand that in America, you got a better chance of anywhere else in the world of doing it on a more private basis, but you can't do it totally. But it's night and day.
Yes, sir.
When you were there, you said that was when Russia invaded Georgia.
Yeah.
What was the what did you hear on the street from the common person and the official word about that? What was their reaction?
You know, I think people were just, you know, you're sort of dismayed. It didn't become, to me, a great topic of conversation. I mean, I knew from talking to IOC people a little bit about what was happening just on a geopolitical point of view, because, as I said, the president of Georgia wanted to pull his team out and all that, and they were able to prevail and make them stay, and, you know, things went on. So, you know, the Olympics, in a lot of ways, can be a sort of a surreal environment because you're in this little cocoon with this great sporting event going on and life's going on, but everybody's focusing on, you know, in a way, it's sometimes the beauty of it that when the sports competition starts, what people are talking about is Michael Phelps going to win 8 gold medals, or is this going to happen, or is that going to happen? So it doesn't really, you know, it doesn't, I don't know what they...
Just curious what the spin was.
Yeah. And it just wasn't, I mean, it was, you know, I read a Herald Tribune every now and then, and you'd read what was going on, but they weren't reacting to that. I mean, they weren't dealing with, they were busy putting on the Olympic Games.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Lon Allen, who's the director of Coca-Cola, was quoted on CNBC saying that China is the 5th largest market for Coca-Cola. And the CEO of Coca-Cola, who spoke here not too long ago about Russia, says he foresees a 5-fold increase in per capita consumption of soft drinks in China. From your experience of being there, do you see more opportunities for big American companies like Coca-Cola?
You know, it's hard for what I was doing and what I see to see that. I mean, I had dinner with Neville Isdell while I was there, and you know, they are very excited about it. And it's one of the things, you know, people used to accuse Coke of buying the Olympic Games for Atlanta, which was so ludicrous on its face, because the last place Coke wanted the Olympics was Atlanta. They own Atlanta. They want to go to China where there are a billion Chinese that don't drink Coke. I mean, it all made no sense. So, yeah, the opportunities are there. I will say that the one group who I think may have been a little bit not as happy as they could have been with the whole games experience was the sponsors. A lot of that had to do with the fact that some of them had built pavilions and things on the Olympic green and there was nobody coming because people couldn't get in. And they felt like maybe there was some you know, the Chinese, probably the last thing on their mind was worrying about whether McDonald's had enough Big Macs sold or something like that. But I've got to think that those opportunities are there. What I don't know from talking to people is how much of a free hand they have. How much, you know, do you have to have Chinese I'm not into the ins and outs of doing business in China. And I think people are still feeling their way along, but I think they certainly are totally focused on that. And it is a huge opportunity for all kinds of consumer products, especially to grow. I mean, McDonald's is about to, you know, Kentucky Fried Chicken was the first franchise that went into China way lower, and McDonald's is about to overtake them in number of franchises. So I think it is a huge opportunity.
Yes, yes. Teresa?
This is a peripheral incident, but what was the reaction there when the U.S. cyclists came through the airport in masks?
It's one of those media stories that comes and goes. You know, if they did that in London, everybody'd laugh and move on, I think, because it'd be kind of like that. But, you know, they immediately came through. That somebody got them. They apologized to the Chinese. I don't think they had any intent of, you know, they were kids on a prank. And I think they were legitimately sorry. And some of them said, you know, we just didn't think we were doing anything. So it was a 24-hour story. Yeah.
What happens to the sports venues now that the Olympics are over?
That's a good question. You know, I think, because I don't know. I mean, the Bird's Nest is there. They'll host track and field events. I'm assuming they can have football games there. There'll be something. I don't know about the swimming pool. I mean, the swimming pool, again, both of those venues to me were architecturally stunning and beautiful in the water cube with all those lights and everything. But inside, they weren't the best. So I don't know. I've heard that they're going to turn that into some kind of an adjunct to their convention center or other things like that. So I don't think they're going to have near the white elephant problem that Athens had, or maybe even Korea had, but because they're resourceful people. But you know, they didn't. A lot of what they did, you know, the field hockey venue was wonderful, but one of them's temporary, and they'll take it down. And you know, look, sports, as you can imagine, is huge there. Yeah. So, like, they will use a velodrome. We wouldn't use a velodrome here in Atlanta if we kept it, but they will use a velodrome. So it's a challenge. But
one of the problems they have is water. The word was that, you know, they're running out of water in Beijing because they've tapped out the aquifers, and they've had to reroute 2 rivers in order to satisfy the water requirements.
You see, you get undercurrents of that in order to do the games, people were running out of water out in the country. And, you know, that's part of these problems I'm talking about. Those are the things. They got to redirect their energies now to solving those problems. It's nice. You know, it's a big ego trip. You wonder where it's worth spending $300 million on an opening ceremonies. You know, the only other opening ceremonies I've seen that was anywhere close to that was the Asian Games in Doha. Qatar, same thing.
Where did you go to North Korea?
Yeah. Well, but, you know, they had a TV screen that covered the whole side of the arena, you know, and elephants coming out of the ground and all these things. But
Yes.
anyway.
Yes.
Charlie, what do you see happening in London 4 years from now?
No, they'll, I told you, they'll do great. I think their biggest challenge will be transportation. Because London doesn't lend itself to what Beijing was able to do. I know London's got the East End, and that's where everything is, and they're building a lot of transport out there, and I think that will work. But I think they'll do fine. They'll have good games. I think they are tremendously excited about the success of their athletes, which was, you know, was really tremendous and bodes well. And that's, you know, in a lot of ways, that's what becomes the country's idea of the success of the games, or how well their athletes do. So, you know, they're going to have the same problems we had. People are going to complain about money, and they're going to spend too much money, and they're going to go over budget and all of those kinds of things. But I think they'll pull it off. But I do think that transport, and I'm not just my riding around London, it's, you know, moderately confusing and rambling and not orderly, so it's going to be a challenge.
Yes, sir.
The Winter Games in Russia that you've been involved in, is that still on?
Oh, yeah.
And
Yeah, it's
what did you learn in China that would apply to the Winter Games? Is it Sochi?
Sochi, yeah, Sochi. You know, obviously what people are worried about in Sochi, and it was sort of there when you go there, Sochi is about 25 miles from the Abkhazia, from the Georgia border, and the area of Abkhazia, which is one of those breakaway provinces. So, you know, that's, and of course the Caucasus is a testy area. You know, it's like everything else. You hope that somehow this will get resolved. I mean, I think one of the problems with the Russians is they'd had some terrorist things in Sochi, which were an outgrowth of the fact that, you know, Abkhazia declared its independence in 1990 or something like that. So they think of themselves. South Ossetia is a little bit different. Sochi's problem is they've got an awful lot to build. And that's their big focus, and that's infrastructure, venues they can build. But it's a beautiful location. It's historically a summer resort, but they're developing now the winter stuff up in the mountains. But You know, again, Putin skis there. He's got a house there. There's a lot of government commitment there, but they've got a lot of work to do.
Sir.
I have a question about legacy in Beijing. I guess, you know, most games leave some kind of legacy, and I imagine that the Olympic green is probably the physical legacy for them. Or if there's another one, I'd love to hear about it. And then the second part of that question is there an emotional legacy that's really going to legitimately stay there? So all those bright-eyed, bushy-tailed young people that were so excited, is it going to be status quo after the games leave, and are they in the ultimate postpartum depression at this point?
No, I mean, that's what I tried to address at the end. I'm hopeful that there will be a psychological and sort of a emotional legacy that they will build on, that they can take great pride in what they've done and use that in a way to, you know, become a real player and a partner with people in the world. And I think, so, obviously, I mean, the infrastructure and everything that's been built, not only the venues, but just the entire, and, you know, when I first went there in 1990, they were just finishing the 3rd ring road. Now they're starting the 6th ring road. You know, I mean, that's like us having 6 perimeter highways in Atlanta. So there's a huge legacy of just growth, the growth in hotels. You know, you don't, you know, tourism and all these kinds of things. But I hope that the most lasting legacy is that it's just a sense of confidence, a sense of pride, a sense of you know, interacting with the world in a more positive way. But, you know, time will tell.
Cedric, you had a question?
Yeah, I was wondering, a quick question on the athletes and the age of the Chinese gymnasts. Has that got any legs?
No, I don't think so. I think the problem there is they're going to have a hard time coming up with unequivocal proof. You know, the procedure is eligibility is a question for each individual sports federation. So each federation makes their own rules. Like, you're allowed to have 14-year-olds in swimming. They had a British athlete, a diver who was 14. You know, each sport has its own rules. Gymnastics has gotten stricter on that because they worried about taking advantage of these young girls and what they did, and they felt like it wasn't healthy for their whole growth process to start doing all those things at an early age. But, you know, apparently all what they've got, which is birth certificate, passport, or whatever, says they're that age. And the evidence seems to be news reports and other things of previous events. But I don't think that'll get anywhere, if you want to know the truth. Because I don't think anybody's going to pursue it hard enough. You know, it's what's the point? What are you going to do? I mean, all they'll do is embarrass them, make them mad, you know, and it'll be a total embarrassment to the government. So I would be surprised if that gets any further.
We talked a little about how the restaurants, the vendors, other people like that were disappointed because they just didn't do the business they expected. And yet that was the Atlanta story.
That's always the
Los
story.
Angeles.
Yeah.
Why don't the organizers get it?
I don't know. Hope springs eternal, I think. And any place that's entrepreneurial, people think they can figure out a way to make money. And that is the biggest myth in the games, that you're going to always fill up your rooms. And part of that is people don't learn. So what hotels do is start charging these exorbitant prices. And then they eventually have to come down and make it. Restaurants think they're going to be full, but they're not going to be full. Now, you take Atlanta. The one guy who did well in Atlanta was Pato, because he understood that. So he rented out his restaurants to groups ahead of time and kind of anticipated the deal because he was smart about it. But you're right. It's the same with homestay. You know, people think they're going to rent their houses to the Sheikh of Dubai for $1 million a night. Yeah, and it just. But you know, people don't learn things very often.
Martin Richter has a question.
Yeah, very impressive game from the point of view of the athletic achievement.
Right.
So many world records being broken and things like that. But remarkably few drug incidents this time. Do you think the message is finally getting through to...
The IOC thinks so, and I think so. And you got to remember, too, that they had a fair number of pre-games drug incidents. So, you know, don't just take that they had 6 positives during the games. They had about 35 or so before the game. So I think all of that is indicative of the fact that their increased testing processes randomly all through. You know, it's not just at games time, it's all through. I think they are having some of it. You can only hope that's the case. That's the only thing I wonder about. I met with the guy here who's trying to get golf on the Olympic program, and I was talking to him about, do you know what you're getting into when you become an Olympic sport? And I got great visions of some Sunday morning, some guy going up on Jupiter Island and knocking on Tiger Woods' door and saying, excuse me, could you give me a specimen this morning? I was saying, I don't know if that's going to work or not. So I'm not sure they know what you're getting into.
Do you have any comments on it?
Oh, I guess the one thing I'd add is that you were talking about where was it sold, but I spent 4 weeks traveling the rest of China before and after, and I think a lot of our during I was only in Beijing the first 6 days, but that a lot of the soul was out there in the countryside, or in Xi'an and Guilin and other cities, and the people were so excited, and there were big screen TVs in every shop.
That's good to hear.
Every
Yeah, that's
public
great.
venue,
Yeah.
you can see, and people were there constantly watching what's going on.
It sort of makes you wonder why they didn't do more of that in Beijing.
Yeah.
But again, I think they really are obviously, in the context of where they were, and especially with the torch relay, they're real nervous about large crowds gathering. And like the obvious place would have been Tiananmen Square to have huge TV screens, but with all the symbolism and dynamite and all that, I just think they weren't going to run that risk. So I'm glad to hear they were doing that.
What happened to your hotels and your restaurants?
I'd have to say that China left something of a bad taste in terms of our group of almost 7 people, but with other people who had booked the hotel and canceled a year ago, and the tour agency had to pay $1,000 a night for those rooms. They sold them. The hotel was totally booked, but they said, well, your contract said you made a deposit non-refundable, so.
You know, it's like the restaurant thing. Another thing the IOC keeps trying to enforce, and we try to do it here, is they make a big deal when you're bidding about getting hotels to agree not to rip you off, to charge you. And then they invariably rip you off. And it happens every time. And one of the things that's going to be interesting, and this is interesting from Chicago's point of view, is this whole media access question and all of these issues. When I always loved it. I have the contract with the host city now is going to be about this thing, because the IOC is trying to put more and more stuff. Because if you hadn't got something you can enforce, you can imagine they'd go to the Chinese and say, we want you to do this, and they'd say, really? Thank you very much. Nice to see you. And so they're trying to put more in the contract. It always amazes me that the contract for the Moscow Games in 1980 is a one-page letter. And now the host city contract, is like this. So, but it's the same issue. They never can get that hotel room rate thing right.
I mean, the restaurant wanted $328 a plate.
Ooh.
Yeah.
There was so much of that going on.
Capitalism at work. Yes,
So
sir.
one last question.
I'd like to add one comment. My daughter teaches English in Hangzhou, one university. She's lived up there a couple of years. Tremendous pride of the youth of China, and they also love the United States.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah, no, that's certainly the sense I get.
Well, Charlie Battle, thank
Yes,
you very
sir.
much for
Thank
being
you
here
all
this
so
morning.
much.